pause the recording for now.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is 4:01 on the dot, so we're going to go ahead and convene the meeting. And I want to acknowledge our virtual participants here. It looks like we've got a fairly good turnout in the room.
It's titillating.
If I could have you, Bill, if I could have you, we're going to start the meeting real quick, and we'll keep the side conversations to a minimum, just so our folks online can hear. We're going to have to keep the side conversations to a minimum, as we always do in this meeting, just because it does make it hard for the virtual participants to hear. So we're going to get started today, and we've got a good turnout virtually, a great turnout in the room. Thank you all for braving the weather. It's great to see that we're getting a little rain. And Alex said,
just so everybody knows, the guest password Wi-Fi is right here on the board. It's welcome with an exclamation for those that need it.
thank you so much, Alex. That the Wi-Fi lifeline has been cast. And I think we'll go ahead and pull up our presentation and agenda and dive right into it. We have got a full agenda tonight. So getting started, I'm just trying not to get blinded by this animal to approach on the person's space. So this is our third meeting. I think we're all getting to know each other by now. We've all got the name tags out. If you came in and didn't grab a name tag, let us know, we'll get it for you, but I think everybody's got one. So that'll save us about 10 to 15 minutes in intros for the agenda. I do want to introduce our planning team really quickly. Got myself, Miles, Kara in the back, John, Cindy, Ellen, Alex, and a guest speaker tonight, Suzanne Wolf, our interim director of community development, who's going to be walking us through how is the growth management system working today. There was so much energy on that topic during our last meeting. We're going to spend the bulk of the time today focused on that, and it is our first agenda item. Because we've got plenty of seats around, and there should be a name tent out on the table for you outside the entry of the room. And so agenda tonight, as I said, we're going to spend the bulk of the time looking at how's the growth management system working today. The questions you all gave us at our last meeting really focus on a few big thematic points. We're going to address the first two of them tonight, how we define and measure development, in other words, growth. You're going to see us kind of switching the vernacular from growth to development in some of these conversations, because where we're going to be headed, bless you, is to really look at how do we collectively define growth, and do we need to redefine growth? So you'll see development subbed in there. Similarly, for the second theme of questions we're going to endeavor to answer tonight is the development restrictions and limitations and how that's working. So we're going to ask you all to hold your questions during that part of the presentation and let Suzanne get through that. And then we're going to have ample time for discussion to really make sure that we're answering the questions that you asked at our last meeting and any new questions that arise tonight. Then we're going to spend just a few minutes looking at where are we headed, the statement of purpose as stated by the Board of County Commissioners and the Planning and Zoning Committee at the kickoff meeting in July that really initiated this process. And then the governance structure. We're going to take a few minutes to talk about the evolving process for selecting our chairs. And then we're going to take a quick look at what happens at our next meeting on October 5th. And then, as always, we're going to have public comment. I don't see any members of the public here as of yet, but should they arrive, we want to create space for them to make a comment as well. So on the next slide, the purpose of the meeting is really to leave here with a solid working understanding of how the growth management system is operating today. And secondly, we want to reintroduce the vision, goals, and values that comprise the purpose of this committee. As I mentioned, that was what was laid out at the July 26th BOCC and P&Z meeting. We also want to advance the process for selecting our committee governance, and you can see our dancing chairs up there. So we'll hopefully advance that topic again tonight. And as I mentioned, the questions we heard from you really fell into four categories: defining and measuring development, development restrictions and the limitations that are in place today, the growth trends, and the future growth. So these first two categories is what we're going to focus on tonight to really set the stage for the trend data and the future growth conversations in our next meetings. So with that, some of the key questions we heard from you were, how does Pickens County define and measure growth today? And how has it evolved over the years? And what is included in the GMQS, the growth management quota system scoring, and why? And how, if at all, has the scoring changed over the last decade? And what is an exception? There's a lot of nuance here. Purpose, what exemptions and how are they determined and evaluated? And then also, what is the TDR program? How is the market for it determined? What restrictions for that are in place? And then what is the balance in the accounting on the TDR program? And then we're going to look at the purpose of growth management. And really, this is what Suzanne is here to talk about. So with that, I'm going to cede the floor and let Suzanne cover the growth management process. Thank you so
Okay, I
much.
just exploded back down with my hands. So sorry. Got a little blue eggs, good timing. Okay, so I'm going to start with the growth management quota system. For some of you, this is going to be a familiar story, and for some of you, probably not so much. So I'm just going to try and walk through it all, and hopefully it'll help educate everyone. So let's do this. Thanks. So growth management quota system. So the purpose of the growth management quota system is to establish a process to compete for new lots or parcels, which is you're subdividing, or you've created 35 acre parcels, which are exempt under state law. We'll talk more about that later, but you're creating new lots or parcels. You're competing for additional floor area, about 5750 for an existing lot or parcel. We also have commercial development and tourist accommodations in the growth management competition system. I think we're not talking so much about that piece now. We're talking more about the residential, but just didn't want to forget that that is part of the system. So those are the categories that people can compete in the growth management quota system. When we talk about growth management, I think there's a piece that we always have to point out is that there are exemptions from growth management. An exemption means that development that does not have to compete through the system. So again, we'll talk more about the competition system, but essentially there were exemptions created that were seen as things that have public benefit or community benefit. They're provided to promote, this is straight out of the code, the development type, character, location, and quality goals of the county to continue an historical practice and to ensure fairness in the system. So again, these were things that the community wanted to encourage. I'm going to get to the full list of all of those exemptions, so we'll get there, but just to sort of know that there are things that are exempt from growth management. If you're not exempt, then you have to compete in growth management. Again, in those categories of you're creating a new lot or parcel, or you're looking for additional floor area. This walks through what it looks like to go through the competition. To see on my screen. So we have annual deadlines. You submit an application. The annual deadline is about having a competition. If there's a lot of people who want to subdivide that year and are creating new lots, they have to go through this competition. So there's one annual deadline. In theory, nobody knows who's applying for what. It's supposed to be sort of secret, but they show up on one day because they're going to compete in going through this system. So there's an allotment available, a certain amount of square footage available, and those applications come in. The applications get scored, and again, we'll show you more slides that kind of, add a little bit more detail onto this basic, but they get scored. There's there's scoring criteria in the code. They go through those to see how they score based on what they're offering, and essentially, it's a lot of looking at, are you doing something that meets the code, or are you doing something that exceeds the code? There's specific criteria for those. Scoring happens at the Planning and Zoning Commission. So what happens is staff does our draft scoring. We review the application, we look at the criteria in the code. We say, we think it gets this many points, which either meets threshold or does not meet threshold, and therefore would or would not be eligible for this growth management allotment for that year. We go to the P&Z, we present that, the applicant has their opportunity to provide their, present their application, and then the P&Z scores and actually grants those allotments. So that process lives with the P&Z. When you get an allotment, if you've been successful, the code now says that those expire after 5 years, except for certain new development rights, which is recognizing that when you're subdividing, there's a lot of other steps in a process that you're going through that are going to take you more than probably that 5-year time frame. So there's an allowance for that. Prior to 2020, allotments didn't expire, and they still don't. So if somebody has gotten an allotment prior to 2020, that allotment does not expire. Anything approved since then now has an expiration date associated with it. Then when this project moves forward, you're finally ready to build the house that you've gotten this allotment for on the lot you've created. Basically, all of those things you committed to in your application, whatever community benefits that might be, or whatever commitments, you have to own up to those. And in some cases, that's, you know, making a payment. In some cases, that's actually making an actual improvement. Again, when we look at kind of the scoring, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's just a quick rundown of kind of, that's the process you're going through if you're competing in growth management for an allotment. So again, back to, we have different categories for competition. So there's new lots and parcels, and additional floor area. But and again, within that, we differentiate between the Aspen urban growth boundary and the rural area. So they're different. What these are showing is annual allotment ceilings. We kind of call them buckets. That's how much square footage is available annually for anyone who's coming into one of those categories to compete. So, you know, for residential development, new lots in the Aspen urban growth boundary, 11,500 square feet. I think that was looking at potentially 3 units at 5,750, you know, if that was, would do that within the rural area. And I'm sorry, 2 units within the rural area, it's 3. And so again, there's a square footage associated with these applications. You come in and you compete for a specific amount of floor area, whether you're competing in additional floor area or competing for a new unit. The deadlines, like I said, these are annual. Once a year, we accept the applications for these various categories. At one time until 2020, we did have the option to have 2 competitions for additional floor area. If it didn't get used up in January, people could come back in July and then have a second competition. That was changed in 2020 to say, let's just do this annually, like all the other ones. So again, there's this annual deadline, the applications come in on that date and then start moving through the process. Sorry, this is really small to look at, but I'll talk a little bit about it. This just shows you the categories that we score, and it's even really small on my screen. So,
and we'll share the whole presentation with you so you can dig into it.
But so generally, I mean, these are the categories. There's a lot more verbiage in the code that, you know, fleshes these out as to what does it mean if you're trying to get points for fire protection or for roads or trails or open space. But these are the categories. It's a score of 0 through 2, essentially 0 being doesn't even meet the code. 1 kind of meets the code, and a 2 would be you're offering something above and beyond the code. And most of the scoring criteria speak about that, you know, more language behind that, but are you offering something that not just benefits your own development, but you're benefiting your neighborhood or somehow the surrounding area? You know, is that a trail connection? Is that, you know, I don't know, something, a road improvement that would improve access into your neighborhood? Those are some of the kinds of things that might be above and beyond what the code would require. Difference here, the 2 differences between the competition for rural area and competition for the urban growth boundary. In the UGB, we eliminated the categories for development below allowable density and reduction of visible mass. And those were really looking at the fact that if you're in the urban growth boundary and you've got a zone district, say R30, which is based on 30,000 square feet, these aren't the properties where we're looking to reduce density like we are in the rural area where you might have 100 acres. And, you know, we're looking to see if you're willing to reduce the allowable density based on zoning. We weren't seeing that so much as a priority in the urban growth boundary because that's where we're looking for the density to occur. So that was taken out as a scoring criteria. And then the reduction of visible mass that does not apply in the UGB but does in the rural area is broken out into a reduction in floor area, reduction in height, or a reduction or committing to put some of your granted floor area in subgrade space. And again, those weren't applied in the urban growth boundary because those zone districts have a floor area ratio. They have a more limited amount of floor area associated with them in the first place. And so again, those weren't seen as important in the urban growth boundary as in the rural area. So just very generally, but those are the differences between those. You can see there's always a threshold score that an application has to meet. So even if there's only one application in the competition, it has to meet threshold. It has to go through the scoring system and at least meet threshold. Obviously, you can get more points, and that's if there's multiple applicants in the pool, you want to have the most points because then you're going to get your allotment first. You get ranked. You know, whoever got the highest score gets their square footage and so on down. We have had a couple of times in the last few years with additional floor area where we had more requests for the additional floor area than was available. So number 3 on the list didn't get their full allotment that they requested. I think we're going to wait for questions till the end. If you can hold your thought.
Just to reinforce that,
Yes.
I've heard Suzanne
Okay.
run through this a couple times now, and a lot of the questions that I have are answered in the subsequent slides. So we're gonna run through it just to see the full package, and then we'll have ample time for Q&A.
Great, and just one more thing on there, if you notice, there's a category called creative bonus. And the way the code looks at that, it talks about something that would be consistent with the purpose and intent of one of those criteria that we already have, but something that just doesn't seem to be captured maybe, or you've already offered something, but you have something more you could offer, again, for road improvements or whatever that might be. Another way you get a creative bonus is something that would implement the comprehensive plan. I don't think I have a good example of that for you, and the third would be that you would build affordable housing rather than pay the employee housing impact fee. So again, I'll just leave it at that, but those are the options to obtain a creative bonus. You still have to meet threshold before you apply creative bonus points, so that you can't use those as an alternative to meeting threshold in the primary scoring criteria. So again, I talked a little bit about this: 0, not meeting code; 1, kind of meets code; and 2, does something above and beyond, solves a problem or resolves a constraint with existing facilities of benefit to the surrounding neighborhood. Those are the kinds of things we're finding there. So that's the competition system. This are the various exemptions, and there's 3 pages of this, you'll see. So there's quite a few, some of which are the ones I think that everybody's kind of most familiar with, that we see a lot, and some, we don't see much of. But, sorry, start there. The first, deed restricted dwelling units, again, if we're looking at something that are seen as a benefit to the community, these were not required to compete in growth management. Development using TDRs. TDRs for either a new lot parcel or additional floor area is an exemption from growth management. So you don't compete, instead you utilize TDRs. And I'm going to talk more about what that looks like to use TDRs. Again, some of these are things about conservation, conservation development, PUD, large lots, things that could be exempt. Sorry, I keep hitting too hard. On this page, development of 5750 square feet of residential floor area on certain types of pre-existing lots. So this is our very across the board, pre-existing parcels, anything created before 1978, which was when growth management started in the county. So we recognized that if your property parcel was created prior to that, there's a development right associated with it, and that is valued at 5,750 square feet. If you're in a board approved subdivision lot, fully developed land subdivision, some of those, you have a development right valued at 5,750. There's a little caveat in there: if you were in the crystal or the frying pan, and your 35-acre parcel was created prior to January 10th of 2000, you have a 5750 right. And what's interesting to know there is 1978, we started growth management. It did not apply in the crystal and frying pan drainages until 2000. So all development in those two drainages were exempt from growth management competition prior to 2000. But if you're creating new lots or 35-acre parcels in the Crystal or Frying Pan after that date, you're having to compete in growth management. The other big highlighted category there is remodels and replacement. That falls under the growth management exemption provisions in the land use code. So essentially, replacement of an existing house, you haven't built up to 5750 and your lot has that right, you can build up to 5750. If you have an existing house that exceeds that 8,000 square feet, you have the right to replace that 8,000 square feet. So again, I think that's, we're definitely seeing with data related to building permits, obviously that's where there's a lot of development happening within that category, none of which is going through growth management competition. It's all exempt from growth management. And these others, I think are, again, just to point out that there's a lot of different exemptions, but again, things that we were trying to either encourage or, recognize certain rights for people moving forward. So that's the complete list of growth management exemptions, some of which we see more often than others. So next, talking about the TDR system. So again, the way it all was started was TDRs were seen as an exemption from growth management. We talk about TDR sending sites and TDR receiver sites. So first are the sending sites, which is where development rights are taken from, severed off of, and then transferred. The sending site is deed restricted against further development. The opportunity to obtain that TDR basically is an incentive for the owner of that property to either preserve or conserve their land or some type of resource. So these are all the types of sending sites we have. I think everybody's familiar with rural and remote. That was the initial TDR sending site, the rural remote zone district. Excuse me, we've added two others over time, transitional residential 1 and transitional residential 2, which is essentially Shadow Mountain and Smuggler Mountain were added into that. And those areas are basically, if you decide you don't want to develop, you have the right to come in and get a TDR. And it's basically a very simple, pretty straightforward process to show that you have a legally created parcel that hasn't merged and you get a TDR. And then it's deed restricted and that's done. The other sending sites, the conservation development PUD, which is a different zone district we've created that limits the development and preserves a majority of the property. A constrained site or a visually constrained site that would not be within those zone districts where you could already pull a TDR. And that was essentially to look at, is something really undevelopable given the code? It's got steep slopes and avalanche and wildlife habitat and whatever all those things might be, some or all of those, it's someplace that nobody really wants to see development. And if an owner recognizes that and says, I'm not going to develop this, I'd rather just get the TDR and put that development right somewhere else, it provides an opportunity for that owner to come to us and ask them for that to get the TDR rather than developing. Limited development conservation parcel, again, an opportunity to basically eliminate your development rights and get TDRs. And then the Pitkin County Historic Register. So if you have a historic resource on your property that is designated to the register, one of the incentives you can ask for is a TDR or TDRs. So just to give you a sense of where TDRs have come from, this annually I do a report to the VOCC in December that goes through all of the TDR numbers, how many have been created and where they're going and all of that. You'll get that in your next packet. So there's a ton more information on this topic there, but just to kind of give you the basic, this just shows, most of the TDRs we have in the county have come out of that rural remote zone district. But then this breaks it down and shows you what has come from constrained and some of those other options that I mentioned. I think that's it for that slide, but I think that's, and then the numbers on the side. Again, out of that annual report, we kind of run through how many have been extinguished, how many haven't, that's where we end up. As of December 2021, there were 129 TDRs that had been issued and not extinguished. out of the 398 that have been created over time. So then the TDR receiver sites are where those development rights land. And those are, again, we're using those TDRs to land for either to create a new development right in the urban growth boundary only, or for additional floor area in the urban growth boundary, or or additional floor area in either urban growth boundary or rural area. Within, let's see, for additional floor area, special review is required, which means a review process. You go to the hearing officer to determine if your receiver site is an appropriate receiver site. That applies throughout the rural area, except within certain specific subdivisions. And hang on in my notes. Oh, well, I listed all of the subdivisions, but just, I won't hit them all, but Starwood, Castle Creek Valley Ranch, Owl Creek Ranch. Again, some of the, big subdivisions where we'd already seen larger homes developed. We said, these are appropriate places for them to be able to use TDRs. We won't add that layer of special review to use the TDRs. They're basically approved as receiver sites, and everything within the urban growth boundary. So again, when I say everything, I guess, knowing that that means not the city of Aspen, they can't receive our county TDRs, but anything within the unincorporated area of the county within the urban growth boundary. So this just, I guess, gives you a little bit more detail on that. The new development right, they can only use a TDR for a new development right in the urban growth boundary, not in the rural area. That does require approval by the BOCC. And then those TDRs, if you're saying, I have a new lot, I've subdivided, you're going to get a TDR in a 2,500 square foot increment. So if you want to build a 7,500 square foot home, that's what your floor area allows. You're looking to use 3 TDRs to get there. And then additional floor area, as I said, in the rural area, if you're not in one of those specific subdivisions, you have to go through special review. Same, the TDR is valued at 2,500 square feet. Except in the TR2 zone district. And let's see if there's anything else there. Final maximum, again, no matter if we're talking about competing in growth management or with TDRs, your final maximum size is 15,000 square feet, or a lesser limit that's been set that a caucus area has recommended. And we have a slide about that later, about where there are limitations of less than 15,000. So there's more information on that to come. Again, just sort of some of the short version of the full TDR report, which you'll get. Just, how many TDRs have been extinguished, certificates issued. Through this, we've deed restricted 9,186 acres of land against development through the creation of the severance of those development rights. Again, a little bit about certain rural remote parcels that have developed, so they will not be eligible to obtain a TDR. And again, those same numbers that you saw before, leaving 129 TDRs available. And again, these were the numbers as of December of last year. This map is, again, from that 2021 report. Obviously, you can't see a whole lot on there, but green are TDR sending sites and orange are TDR receiving sites. The orange does not distinguish between, in this map, between whether it's being used for a new development right or additional floor area, but it just kind of gives you a good graphic of, where the TDRs are coming from and where they're going to. For that. So again,
So are we going to hold questions to the end?
Yeah, we just got a few more slides.
Okay, so there were a lot of terms and standards embedded in Suzanne's presentation about the growth management system. And at the last meeting, several of you had some really good questions about, where those standards came from, what they relate to. And so I'm going to try to briefly cover a few of those questions. One, I think this came from Jessica initially, and that was, so how and why did the county establish 15,000 square feet as a house size limit, as a cap? And Suzanne alluded to that in a few places in her presentation. So this goes back to 1989-ish, when several of you may remember that Prince Bandar built a 55,000 square foot residence in Picken County. And at the time, it was very unique, and there's nothing in the land use code that precluded building a residence of that size. And it really didn't feel like a residence, anything that we had knew of up until that time. And it didn't act like a regular residence either, because as a practical matter, it was an embassy. And the Saudi prince had staff housed in the residence. So it looked different, it felt different, and it really was different. In fact, we didn't know how to accommodate a septic system for that large a home. And that was a real engineering feat, apparently. So with that, the Board of County Commissioners was a bit alarmed, and they convened a citizens committee, not unlike this one, and said, give us a recommendation for a maximum house size cap, because this isn't really going to work moving forward. We're concerned about a proliferation of homes of this size. So the committee, I think after a lot of deliberation, someone said 40 meetings later, right? Which is Suzanne counted, which is kind of frightening. They came up with a recommendation for a 15,000 square foot house size cap. And that committee was made up probably of realtors, contractors, as I recall, and I don't remember all the details, but so that recommendation went forward. The Board of County Commissioners adopted a land use code amendment in 1993, and adopting that 15,000 square foot max house size cap, but with the caveat that you could actually exceed the 15,000 square foot cap at that time, subject to a special review and approval from the board. And maybe they thought the 15,000 square feet was a little too restrictive. So in 1994, the Transferable Development Rights Program was implemented as part of the Rural Remote Zone District, and TDRs were born. And so in 1995, that 15,000 square foot cap was modified still to allow people to exceed the 15,000 square feet with special review. But then at that point, a TDR was also required to go bigger. In 2000, for various reasons, which at some point we'll probably go into here, the Board of County Commissioners enacted a moratorium, and they were really looking at growth and house size as one of the triggers for that conversation. And one of the results of that moratorium was that 15,000 max cap size became a hard cap. They decided that 15,000 square feet was big enough. So
I will say, sorry, clarify, the 40 meetings was the P&Z and the VOCC.
okay,
I
so,
don't know how many meetings the committee had.
so good clarification. Thanks. We have that.
I don't know if that's better or worse.
Right. So then Suzanne mentioned that there are areas in the county where that 15,000 square foot cap is not in place. And as many of you know, because you're part of caucuses, there are 11 or 12, 13 caucuses in the county, and they develop master plans. And as part of those master plans, which make recommendations for land use code policies and regulations, they said, you know what, 15,000 square feet is too big in terms of rural character in our neighborhood. So several of those caucuses, Emma, Snowmass Capital, Upper Moon, Frying Pan, and within the Basalt UGB have max house sizes that range from 5,750 to 8,250 as the cap. So they don't go up to 15,000 square feet. And for the remainder of the county, all of the other remaining caucus areas, 15,000 square feet is still the max cap, and I won't go through all the location of all the caucuses, but they are up there on that map. And, you know, as a practical matter, some of those caucuses are still debating whether they think 15,000 square feet is still a good standard for their neighborhood. So this is in flux always. So then, oops, that's all right. So then again, I think this may have come from Jessica. Good question. And so we've been throwing around standards, and I think everybody's heard about 5,750 square feet as being the floor area that's exempt from growth management. How did we get there? Going back to 1999, when we had a planning staff member, Dave Preston, who some of you may or may not remember, and he did an analysis when he got to the office. He was coming right out of grad school, and he was looking at house size as it relates to employment generation. This was something he saw as a trend when he got here. He was looking at second homes versus homes that are typically occupied year round. And so he did an analysis, and the conclusion of the analysis was that, in fact, employment demands increase with the size of residences. And as service employment demands increase, so do impacts to roads, traffic, air quality, the need for affordable housing, et cetera. And the distinction between these larger homes and the smaller homes was that the larger homes, and it was a threshold that we'll look at in a graph in a minute, there was a threshold at 5,000 square feet, and above 5,000 square feet, he found, and these were primarily second homes, that people were house management companies to do things like snowplow, pool and spa maintenance. They were also bringing in people as personal trainers, as massage therapists, and florists and gardeners, and the like. And so, yeah, there were resulting impacts as we still see today to roads, traffic, etc. So it was decided then, moving forward, that those increased impacts warranted competition in the growth management system, and that our previous practice of looking at residential units as a standard for competition and growth management really should be replaced with the standard for for square footage, because square footage related directly to the impacts associated with that employment generation that increased as house size increased. So I'm going to show you a scattergram. I hope you can see that. This came out of the report. And basically on the bottom axis, you've got square footage of homes. The left-hand axis is showing full-time and equivalents, basically employees. And then the vertical line is drawn at the 5,000 square foot threshold there. And to the left of the line are the smaller homes. And to the right of the line are the homes in excess of 5,000 square feet. And as you can see, the employment generation for those under 5,000, really under 4,000 square feet, was minimal to negligible. And as the home size grew, so did the employment generation. So that led to, in 2000, catch up to myself, that led to a couple of changes in the land use code in the year 2000. One of them was to, as I said, acknowledge that our prior practice of using residential units as the standard for growth management allocations should be changed to a square footage allocation to really tie the impacts associated with growth to square footage, because that most readily related to the impacts. And the other change that was made was to establish a 5,750 square foot exemption from growth management, recognizing that below 5,000 square feet, there was no need to compete in growth management because the impacts weren't being generated and didn't need to compete to address those impacts. But above 5,000 square feet, there were impacts being generated. And so the 5,000 square foot was the demarcation between fewer impacts and greater impacts, and the 5,750 square feet became the growth management exemption, where less than that number, that square footage, was not required to go through growth management. It was exempted because the impacts were negligible. More than 5,750 square feet required growth management competition, up to that max that had been created at 15,000 square feet. I think that those. And remember too, in 2000 is when the Board of County Commissioners was looking at growth, had enacted their moratorium, and they were really becoming more and more conscious of the growth that was related to square footage and house size and the impacts there too. So next one. So then initially that growth management exemption for 5750 only existed in the rural portion of the county. And you could build up to 15,000 square feet in the urban growth boundary without competing. The thinking, as I recall, being that, you know, in the urban growth boundary, the impacts could be absorbed because there were services in place, there was infrastructure in place to absorb those impacts. Ultimately in 2006, when we completely revamped the land use code, the 5750 applied across the county, within the UGB and within the rural portion of the county, because the board recognized that impacts of larger homes were countywide and should be assessed equally regardless of the location of property in the urban growth boundary or in the rural area. So then, let's see, again, Jessica, I'm just not putting you on the spot, but these were great questions. And there's so many standards embedded in our code that it can get pretty daunting. There is a 4,000 square foot subgrade space allowance in the land use code. So that's basically saying, yeah, you've got your above grade floor area 5750, which is exempt. And then you can also add in 4,000 square feet of subgrade space. And the argument that was made at the time for the subgrade space was that, you know, you can't see it. It doesn't have visual impacts. And a lot of people thought that, you know, that was really the most significant impact. And so and 4,000 square feet of subgrade space is not insubstantial. That's a lot of ground. And again, the commissioners looked at the urban growth boundary area and said, you know what, that 4,000 square feet in the urban growth boundary area is not going to count against your overall floor area of 15,000 square feet or 5750. Because again, I think the thinking was that, you know what, it doesn't have visual impact, and in the urban growth boundary area, any other impacts can readily be absorbed because the infrastructure and the services exist there. In the rural area, you can still build 4,000 square feet of subgrade space, but it counts against your overall floor area of 5750 or 15,000. So as a practical matter, and I'll end here, in the urban growth boundary area, you do have that 15,000 square foot cap, but you also have 4,000 square feet of subgrade space that does not count against that cap. So as a practical matter, in the urban growth boundary area, you can build up to 19,000 square feet. And Suzanne, correct me if I don't have that right, but that I'm going to end. There's so many nuances, and actually Suzanne and Cindy and I.
The cap is hard. It's the below grade and it's the gross floor area, which we haven't talked about floor area versus gross floor area, but right. You can't, your 4,000 does not go beyond the 15.
Okay.
Unless you have special dispensation.
But it does,
I was
but,
at the Ruby property today, so yeah.
Right. Okay. So I stand corrected. And as you can see, these are very nuanced, and and complex. And some of us do, you know, amongst ourselves say, what? So I'm going to end with that and appreciate your listening to this presentation because it's complex stuff, but your questions are great and we hope to continue to get them and respond. So I'll leave it there.
And I get to keep going. We're not ready for your questions yet.
Not quite. Yeah.
So again, responding to a few more questions. What's the role of zoning in determining land use patterns, urban and rural boundaries and characteristics? And I just kind of grabbed straight out of the code where we talk about, you know, what's the difference between the urban area, the urban growth boundary and the rural areas. And it was the city and the county worked together to establish the Aspen urban growth boundary. The idea was that within the limits of the UGB, development is permitted at greater densities, and those outside in the rural area would have a lesser density. Our zone districts are then basically are intended to correlate with that. The zone districts in the urban growth boundary are the R15s, R30s. That means a 15,000 square foot lot, a 30,000 square foot lot. You know, again, we're not talking acres, we're talking square feet. The affordable housing zones can only be within the urban growth boundary because that's where we wanted to encourage affordable housing. In the rural area, we have those, you know, less dense zone districts, AR10, RS20, 30. That's 10 acre zoning, 20 and 30 acre zoning. So rural remote is a rural area zone district. So again, when the 2006 code was written, it was written very carefully to say, these are the zone districts that are intended to be used within the urban growth boundary, and these are the zone districts intended to be used within the rural area. Obviously, there are places where there's some crossover, but that was trying to really distinguish between where we wanted to see density in the urban area and less density in the rural area. Okay, that's the urban growth boundary map. Again, you probably can't see that a whole lot, but again, when you can look at it in more detail later, you can. But there's an urban growth boundary for the city of Aspen. There's also an urban growth boundary for the town of Basalt. So we also have worked with Basalt and we recognize their urban growth boundary and accommodate for that within our zoning as well. So keep it in there. And then 35 acre exemption I referenced earlier. I think a lot of people are familiar. Under state law, you can create a 35 acre parcel. You have enough land to do that. Exempt from our subdivision review process. You can walk into the clerk's office and record a plat that creates as many 35 acre parcels as you can. But under our code, that doesn't mean you can actually develop those 35 acre parcels. You have to obtain a development right for it. Just because you can create it under state law doesn't mean you automatically have the right to build something on it. So those parcels have to compete in growth management to obtain a development right if you have the land to create that 35 acre parcel. Again, I think I talked a little bit about, but if your 35 acre parcel was created prior to 1978, when we created the growth management system, those parcels are exempt. I was just talking to somebody today about Soapers Mountain Ranch. Those 35 acre parcels up West Soapers Creek Road were created prior to that date in 1978. So those have a right to build 5750 to start with. If they want to build more than that in the Emma Caucus area up to 8250, they either compete in growth management or use a TDR for that additional 2,500 square feet. Different in the Crystal and Frying Pan, since growth management didn't start there till 2000. But again, so that's just talks about the 35 acre exemption. Sure. The timeline, again, I think we've talked a little bit about this. 1970s, the first growth management plan. 1978 was when we adopted the growth management quota system. The quiet years. Like that, that's good. Yeah, not much changed in the 1980s. We were just going through the system. 1993, talked about that 15,000 square foot cap. The creation of the TDR system, where I think things started to change. We started to go, right, somebody could use a TDR to create a new development right rather than competing in growth management. And then the big changes happened in 2000 and 2006. 2000 with the moratorium, which led to substantial changes in the rural area growth management. 2006, we adopted a new land use code, and at that time incorporated the changes in the urban growth boundary as well. But so that's 2006 is when 5750 kind of came into being and became the number that we work off of. Is that end for me?
Yeah,
Okay.
and thank you all for your patience in listening through this, and thank you to Suzanne and Ellen for that very comprehensive summary. So we want to get to your questions now. We do have a bunch of other questions for the trends and the future growth data, but based on what you've heard and how it's defined and managed today, I'm sure I saw a lot of notepads going with questions. So we'll open it up and we'll go back and forth between our in-person and virtual participants. And I do want to acknowledge Suzanne Caskey with planning and zoning. I don't know if you came in later, if I missed you, but thank you for being here, Suzanne. So what questions do we have now?
A little uncertain, the 4,000 square foot subgrade in the urban growth boundary, does that count or not towards the 5750?
It does not count. So when we talk about gross floor area for the urban growth boundary, you have floor area that's allowed based on your ratio. Then you get exempt subgrade space and exempt garage space. When you exceed 5750, adding all of those up, you need TDRs or growth management for that additional. But the 4,000 is not part of, well, I guess, wait, your question was, is it part of the 5750? Maybe I did.
No, is it or is it not exempt? You just said it is exempt, right?
It is exempt. This is always the hardest conversation. It does not count as floor area. So if you have a lot on Red Mountain, R30, say you're allowed 4,000 square feet based on your floor area ratio. You also are then allowed 4,000 below grade and 750 garage. So that's a total of 8,750. But to get from 5,750 to 8,750, you're going to need a TDR or to compete in growth management. Is that get you there? I know that's one of the hardest conversations we have with people in my office.
Yeah, and John, and then we'll check in with virtual. And if you have a question, tip up your name tag, I'll know where to go. But John, please.
I'm wondering if you guys could explain to me a little bit more the replacement remodel piece of the exemption. Seems like my experiences, I've seen small historic buildings that have been scraped and 5750 houses built. I'm just trying to understand, wrap my head around that. I don't think that.
I'll leave out the historic piece of it because that probably gets into a whole other conversation. But if you have an existing house and you're a pre-existing lot, legally created, I don't know, maybe meta, whatever. I have an existing house, but I'm going to tear that down and rebuild. If you have the right to build up to 5750, your lot has that right. You're right. You're not limited to only replacing the amount of square footage you have. So your lot still has that 5750 right.
Yeah, no, that's good. Can I ask one or really quick question? I'm wondering, of all the people that are applying for allotments that go through the competition, is there a substantial number that don't get approved, or does everyone eventually sort of get approved and figure out ways to get through the system?
I'd say very few don't get there. I mean, again, like I said, if there is competition and there may not be enough floor area available, we've had a couple who did not get their complete allotment. But I guess one point to make there is very little, and I think there'll be, again, as you get into more data and information, very little competes in growth management. I mean, over the last 10 something plus years, I mean, maybe, I don't know, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but in terms of creating new lots, we see very little new subdivision or creation of new parcels in the county. So we see very little competition for that. For additional floor area, we see that a little bit more. But again, it's a very small number of properties that are going through that system. But back to your initial question, can people get there? Yes. They're all hiring, a local planning consultant to work through the system. And for better or for worse, I mean, I call it a game. I mean, it really is. It's how can I play with all of this point system and go, I know I don't want to reduce my density, so what can I do in the wildlife category? Or is there something I can provide elsewhere to try and make it work? So again, anybody who's coming through that system is working with somebody or a team of somebody's who are very familiar and kind of know how to work with the system. Play the game, exactly.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. And I want to check in with Emma and our virtual team. I don't see any virtual hands up. Is that correct, Emma?
That's correct. Yes, if anyone online has a question, please. Oh, Lydia, I see you just raised your hand. Go ahead.
Lydia, why don't you unmute and then we'll go clockwise, starting with Blake after Lydia.
Sorry, I always forget about that unmute. Anyway, I had a question about the 4,000 square feet of subgrade that is not allowed in rural and remote, and just wonder why that is. I mean, I assume you can build the 4,000 square feet subgrade, but it is not included. It is not allowed to that. I think you said 19, past the 19,000 square feet.
So I guess, yeah, a couple things. So it's not rural, just to make sure we're really clear, not rural remote, it's rural area.
Oh, okay.
That's confusing, just to make, so we're just talking UGB or rural area, but in the rural area, right, if you want below grade space, you're more than welcome to have it, but it's gonna count towards your floor area, whether that be 5750 or if you've gone beyond, if you've done something to go beyond that. It does not count as floor area. It doesn't count against your floor area in the urban growth boundary.
Right, but I'm just curious why that is.
Cindy,
Is
you wanna
there-
jump on that one? I'm putting her on the spot for that one.
That was a concession somewhere along the way. Yeah, I think it was that there was more disturbance with
Okay,
digging down deep, and that it was thought that intensity could be handled in the urban area, but maybe not so much in the rural area, so you'd have to compete for it. That, I mean, that's a mixture of many years of, I don't really remember why.
I was just curious, and so that answers it.
And if I may, Lydia, I think there has been so much conversation over the years about whether that 4,000 square foot subgrade space should or should not be counted as floor area. What are the implications? What are the impacts associated with that space? So it may be something that we'll have more conversation about as part of this group.
Okay, great, thanks.
Ellen, that's a really good point. The purpose of today is really to understand how it's working today so that we can know where we go in the future. And Blake.
Sure. Can you speak to the value of the TDRs? Because I think it'd be important for people to understand what people are getting in return for relinquishing their development rights.
So the county has never, it's all on the free market, so the TDR value fluctuates, same as the real estate market fluctuates. It's fluctuated pretty high right now. I think most people are aware, but maybe if you're not, for, many years, up until the last year or two, we were in the $200,000 range for a TDR for very consistently for quite a number of years. And then fall of 2020 is when, we saw it jump to 400,000 and then, to 800,000. And then it's topped out at about 2.1 million. And it's for that same 2,500 square feet of floor area that was allowed if you paid 200,000 for it or you're paying 2.1 million for it. Again, I haven't done the update yet for this year, but I could get you some preliminary numbers on, how many we've seen sold. They're definitely selling at that price, or have sold over the last year plus. But right, the county has never played any role in the value, the dollar value.
It sounds like when we look at data trends at our next meeting too, that's maybe one of the trends we can potentially it's the TDR market. Like, thanks for the question.
Are they actually selling at that price?
Yes.
It's a commodity and it runs with the market.
And
There've been some recent sales around 1.8.
Right, I mean,
price is
that
too
was,
bad.
yeah, it's, you know, it's softened.
The
a
market's
little bit.
correcting.
Right.
On John, think back on John, is there a date each year by which you have to have your GMQS submission in? And have you ever had anything happen like what happened with the city this year, where 6 are allowed single-family applications each year now, and they all went to one planning company? Has that ever happened to you all before? That, I think probably John was probably thinking about that, I think, when he asked that question.
So we do have an annual deadline if you're submitting to compete in growth management. And again, those deadlines are different for those categories. No, we have not seen anything like that. Again, we have the allotment, the square footage allotment that's available. No, I mean, we've never, you know, people come in, you know, they submit their applications on that date and then we start to run them through the system. I mean, again, we could have, you know, we haven't seen it
It
in
just hasn't
recent time. Right, I mean, we could have applications for more than is available. And then, right, we would run them through the competition system and then they would get ranked, having gone through the system. But so it's, I guess, I'm not as familiar with, you know, how the city's doing it now, but we would take all of those through the system, through the scoring system to see how they ended up getting ranked. Versus you're the first one in the door at a certain, you know, at time, and therefore you're in. That's not how our system works.
And then a question about the 15,000. Why did it jump from 5,000 plus or minus all the way to 15, almost triple, instead of maybe going to 10? Was it all the crushing burden of the Bondar 55,000 that was just sort of hanging over everybody, or they wanted? Why did it get to 15?
Well, it actually started at 15. The 5750 came after the 15,000 square foot cap was adopted. And the 15,000 square foot cap was in response to the 55,000 square foot home that had been built. And it was the result of a citizens committee recommendation saying 55,000 maybe is too big, but 15,000 square feet is perhaps more reasonable. And so that was the first thing that happened in terms of reducing or placing a cap on house size. And then after Gabe Preston's analysis and a few other analyses that followed, the 5750 growth management exemption was established, recognizing that above that threshold, there were impacts that really needed to be addressed through the growth management system because they related to growth specifically. And below that threshold, the impacts were really negligible in comparison. So below that threshold, growth management competition was then not required. So does that clarify? So the 15,000 square foot came first, and it was in response to the 55,000 square feet. And then the 57.
It seemed very modest, didn't it?
Yeah, very modest. And the 5750 now works side by side with that. The 5750 is the growth management exempt space. And the 15,000 square foot is the max that you can get to through growth management or exemptions. Does that help?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And Bill, it's a great question. It's why we put that timeline together to show sort of the trajectory there. And Alex, I think it's slide 35 that shows in 93, the 15,000 cap was implemented. And it wasn't until the 2000 and 2006 updates that 5750 was implemented. So that was the trajectory of the planning process. And Mona.
I'm not sure that there's an answer to the question I have, but I just wonder if transferring the TDRs, if that sort of loads development. I know you said that they go to the urban growth boundary and everything, and they're like, well, the urban growth boundary can handle this. But I wonder if it doesn't actually load development to a greater extent in the areas where it's happening. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering that. I know we're trying to do some preservation of areas and try to keep from bigger houses, but I'm just wondering if that, doesn't have a overly oversized impact on the urban growth boundary as a result of wherever the TDRs are going. We have that map, let me put that map back up that shows where.
Oh, the sending and receiving.
Sending and receiving areas.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, right, I mean, I think the map sort of shows it in terms of an answer to your question, I think that's why maybe you all are here. But again, I mean, right, there's clearly an incentive was created for the additional floor area to say, urban growth boundary is a place where you can use the TDRs without a review process. So I mean, that was part of an incentive to say, this is an area where we would prefer to see some of this happening. But it wasn't that we didn't allow it outside, again, there was just more process. In terms of, I guess, sort of the bigger question, I think is more a discussion item of, right, is that the way it should continue or not?
Were there unintended consequences when we allowed TDRs to be used as floor area that could be transferred to various parts of the county? Clearly, the TDRs achieved the intent of pulling development out of the backcountry areas and the agricultural lands. But does it still work to have them landing really anywhere in the county, the urban growth boundary area or the rural portion of the county?
And I think I'll add just one thing too. I think it's really important to know that the TDRs are allowing you to get to what zoning allows you to develop. So if your zoning is allowing you, like I said, on Red Mountain, 4,000 plus, another 4,000 plus 750, that's what, before there was a TDR program, you were allowed to build. We might not have been seeing it as much as we are now, but now they're building that and they're using the TDRs to, again, deal with that square footage beyond the 5,750. So same in the rural area, again, the zoning is what allows 8,250 or 15, but we created this 5,750 as well. This is how much you get by right. But if you really want to keep going to where zoning allows you, you're going to need TDRs or growth management to get there. So I think that's important to understand.
Can I just make a comment? TDRs in the marketplace it's recognized as the easiest way to get to the maximum allowed zoning. And the GMQS system is just, people just sort of, it befuddles people to try to understand it and they don't want to mess with it. And that's one of the reasons why the value of TDRs has gone up. The demand has gone up so much. It's just the easiest and more certain route.
And I think that is a really great point. I mean, and I think that was the intention. I mean, the intent Cindy was saying yesterday when it was first created, it was meant to be complicated and difficult for somebody to get through growth management. I mean, that was part of it. TDRs then provided a different way out. It is complicated. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of staff time and energy. It takes, I look at Cliff, it takes a lot of P&Z energy when they have to score these applications. I don't think anybody's walking out of a growth management competition and feeling great about, where we ended up, So again, it's complicated and yes, I know that does send people a different direction to use the TDRs. But either one is a tool to basically get you to where what your zoning allows you. That 5,750.
I thought you answered this question. Partially.
He's the leader.
I'll allow it, but I think this conversation to make sure we all are comfortable with how it's working today is critically important before we can move forward. So we need to create space for it.
So based on the document I have here, I see 211 TDRs were used outside the UGB, both salt and asphalt, of 389. So more than that are landing outside the UGB, being received outside the UGB. That number might be off a little bit, but gives you an idea how much it's really moving construction and development. from backcountry into other zones that allow it.
I think that's one of the fundamental questions for this group going forward is what is the role of TDRs, given the ratio that's been pointed out. So,
I didn't go there. I didn't go there.
Carrie, did you have a comment?
No.
Louder, Miles.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Spoken.
Perfect. And can everybody on virtual hear okay, Emma? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Brian,
So we've started to get into this a little bit, but I would be curious in your views on, or your background on, what are the most common criticisms, questions that you get from people going through this process? What is it that, what problem are we trying to solve in this round?
Of the competition, like competing in growth management.
The whole process, you know, I look at this and go, okay, it seems to be doing a fair job of limiting growth. And it seems to be doing an okay job of trying to funnel growth in towards the urban growth boundary. It's not perfect, but sort of why are we looking at it now? Other than just to look at it, because it's been 15 years since the last set of changes or thereabouts. And what are, from your perspective as folks that are very close to it, what are the 2 or 3 things that keep coming up in criticisms from folks, either going through the process or other stakeholders? Like, what do you hear? Like, I wish we could fix X.
It's not just make it stop.
Yeah, I mean, other than the obvious, which is I don't want any controls on it, period. Like, is there something that's crying out to be addressed?
You want me to say, you know, again, if you're talking, I think I started, and I keep looking at Cliff because I know how much he enjoyed scoring growth management applications. You know, again, like I said, I think taking something through growth management competition and knowing in the end that it's such a small percentage of the development that's occurring out there seems like an inordinate amount of time and energy to go through that to get some community benefits. You know, but in the end, we're only getting that for this very small subset of the development that's occurring. So, you know, so I think that's a criticism. I mean, I think Cindy, maybe you can jump in more on the bigger, you know, I think, right, the piece of everybody feeling like there's so much going on. What is it that growth management really does for us?
And I could jump in too before Cindy does. I think one of the things we hear is that there are so many exemptions, all well-intended and all hopefully achieving community benefits, but there's so many exemptions that is there still really, are we still managing growth at the rate and of the type that we should be managing that's bad English, but, and so, you know, is the system even, is the growth management system as it was initially established in 1978 still achieving the community benefits that are relevant today? And is part of the issue that there are so many exemptions that the competition, because for various reasons, is not really much of a competition. That's just one element that I understand.
It's the most dramatic change since the downzoning of Pitkin County in the mid-70s, when almost 25 or 30,000 homes could be built in the county at that point. And it was a concession in a way later to address the need, but I think it's limited it in a way that I think has been incredibly successful.
The problem is it's not sustainable anymore. That's
15
that's the
years.
main problem
Right.
with the system the way it is today.
and Brian's asking the right question, I think, is what is the problem we're trying to solve? And I know Suzanne is a member of the P&Z. I thought maybe I saw your hand go up.
Yes, I just wanted to say that a part of the problem is that I think that the VOCC is trying to address is how does growth and the growth in the county affect us locally in terms of climate change? And how can we do our part And can that be a part of the growth management process? And Tim Eston, I just wanted to say to you a moment ago that because I don't see the business side of this, so this is a great help to me. I was just wondering, because of what you said, do you think that because people don't want to go through the growth management process, and so they go directly to TDR, gives us a less refined system, less refined end result?
Yeah, I think so. The GMQS system is more robust in terms of controlling growth. And if everyone were made to go through that, you have another avenue that's just simply much easier, much less brain damage, and more certain. And that seems to be in the marketplace, the preferred course.
So a caveat to that, though, I can see with TDRs well over 1.5 million, you can compete in GMQS for a whole lot less than that. And I can see if the values stay high, or even if they correct, if they've started to do for TDRs, that there could be more emphasis on people starting to go through growth management again, instead of, and there's an availability issue with TDRs until recently. Now, I mean, they're starting to be more plentiful again because people, if I can get $2 million from my TDR, I'll sell it. But I can see there being more pressure on growth management with the price of TDRs having been, when they were $250,000 or $300,000, it made no sense to go to GMQS. Too much risk, too much cost, too much uncertainty, didn't make any sense. But I can see it starting to switch the other way.
It seems to me, and this is out of my ignorance, because I don't know the things that you and Tim know, that we've moved into a realm where it just doesn't matter how much money it costs. We just crossed the bridge. It's too far.
I've got to, I would probably disagree with that a little bit, because if it didn't matter, then the prices would have kept going up. I mean, there were a 2-1. We have a sale at $1.8 million. You can buy one now for $1.7 million. So there has been market resistance. So I don't think that it's just unlimited.
And to bring it back to the comment from Brian, I think the role of TDRs and the relationship to GMQS is one of those key problems that as we look at the future, those are one of the things we're going to debate. I think for tonight, I want to make sure we get through how are those working today before we start to look at the data, the trends that we're seeing. To Randy's point, what's the market doing? And Nick, did you have
I just wanted to chime in with what Tim was saying earlier with amount of money that TDRs cost doesn't seem to really drive things. I mean, I think you were saying earlier that GMQS people haven't been using that really for the last 10 years. It's not really been as effective. Like people aren't going there because it is uncertain, because it takes a lot of effort, brain damage, and time. It's very particular projects that end up going that route, and it's easier to go with the TDR. You know you're going to get the square footage. You pay that amount. It's just the price of building a multi-million-dollar home, and it's just the cost of doing that. Whereas if you're going to ask someone like might be able to, you're going to go through the system, but you're not certain, you're not going to actually know if you're going to get the approvals for this. That's a huge risk that a lot of people don't want to deal with, and so that's why it keeps on funneling. I think it's boils down to, in my mind, simple economics, not just dollar values, but like resistance and the easiest path forward for achieving whatever goal is desired.
Yeah, the path of least resistance and predictability.
And if I may, just to piggyback on to Suzanne's comment, which is so relevant, in 1978, when the growth management system was implemented, we should have been looking at climate change as an element of growth because it was happening back then, but we weren't. And I think now climate action is really something that the Board of County Commissioners is focusing on, and we need to understand whether the growth management system that's in place today works relative to impacts associated with climate change, or whether it needs to be tweaked or completely revamped, whether we should be looking at an altogether different system. But that is a very relevant point that, you know, that's something that's changed a lot. Well, it hasn't, but we haven't addressed it.
That's a good point, Element, especially when we start to look forward in terms of what are the goals and the vision that the VOCC and P&Z set forth. Climate action is at the forefront. And Debbie, I want to make sure we hear from everybody.
Okay, well, this kind of leads in, kind of, as you were going through, Suzanne, the, all the different exemptions for the growth management or the scoring system. What I would like to see is that we throw climate change questions and scoring in there and employee housing. Because I was like, TDRs have made it really easy to build these big houses that burn a whole lot more energy, but they also create an enormous amount of employees. And that graph that you have, that study, I'm not seeing that. I mean, I'm just someone who works at these houses. There's 20 cars there on that big old house, different people doing stuff on a regular basis. And
Work
when the
people's
people
cars,
aren't
yeah.
there, they're doing all these projects and all these cleaning, you know, cleaning the storm, cleaning the pool. I mean, it's amazing all the subcontractors that come to these houses. I mean, and we'll be there all day long, just gardening. And there'll be 20 different trucks come by to do something for several hours to whatever. And then when the people, that they don't come as much when the people are there, but then when the people are there, it's the floral delivery and the spa people and the, you know, it continues. It's just a different kind of subset of people. And I just think the employees that these houses generate is way bigger than that 3 or 4 employees a year.
And I think, Ellen, that was a 1999 study. And so I think we'll be looking at some newer data too, because I think what you're saying anecdotally, Debbie, is bearing itself out.
Yeah, I
with some
don't
of these
have
impacts.
numbers. I just have this experience of, you know, one week we were thinking, God, there's so many people here. It's like, oh, next week when we're here, let's count. And we decided to count. And there was literally 22 cars that day that came by, including our 2 cars, because we had a big crew. So it was just interesting. So basically, I'd like to see different things considered and then somehow, I guess, making TDRs not such an easy workaround, you know, for GMSQ or GMQS. One quick question, and this will be easy to answer. Did the 2006 changes to the land use code, did those affect the caucus limits or, you know, saying the 5750, or did that just make it that you're 5750 and whatever the caucus limits, you have to use TDRs to get to that? The caucus limit is instead of the 15,000, is that? Okay.
Right, and some of those came, they've come along the way. Different caucuses have decided that they wanted a limit. And then, you know, came forward to the county through their master plan to say, implement this, and that's when it went into the code. So some of those were in the code as of 2006, and then several of those have come since then. To your other points, I mean, yes, out of that little tiny thing you could see on the screen, yes, you picked up on that. There's nothing in the scoring that addresses energy, you know, climate, any of those kinds of impacts. So, you know, that's definitely something that's been noted a lot. On the affordable housing piece, in terms of it being in the scoring, it was once upon a time, I mean, again, sort of old scoring. Once the county adopted the employee housing impact fee, that was no longer a part of the scoring process, because basically previously you were scored, you obtained, you know, the right to, it was only subdivision. This was before we were doing additional floor area. Only those new lots that were created had to compete in growth management, and they had to mitigate for the employees that they were generating if you were creating a new lot. Once we changed everything, when we adopted an impact fee, that impact fee applies across the board, not just to new lots that are being created. It applies to every house that's being built in the county, whether you're a pre-1978 parcel or whatever. If you exceed 5750, you're going to pay an impact fee. So again, 5750 plays out again in terms of the impact fee. So again, just, I mean, that's,
Yeah.
you know, again, there's probably a whole other conversation about, you know, kind of the housing and impact fee. But once we did that, it applied across the board throughout the county. And then that fee is used to, you know, try to create housing opportunities.
Right, okay. And then is that, that 4,000 subgrade, is that, affect the impact fee too? Because I could see that generating a lot of employees to pretty much put down there.
That's a great question, and I assume so, because it's like interior, it's more of a, we use like the way the building code calculates, not necessarily the way we calculate under the land use code. So yes, I believe so, but I can double check that.
Sorry, what was that question again?
It was about the 4,000 square foot subgrade.
Yeah. If
That-
it counted to the employee generation?
Yeah,
Yeah,
because I could
okay.
see it
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
affecting that with the pool and
I'll
the
say yes,
spa.
but I'll confirm.
Yeah, a trainer to go with.
Right.
Yeah, we did a 2-level basement on the west end, and the lowest level being basketball court. So, you know, this is stuff like that, but my questions here are, back to the creative bonus. I'm wondering, last I heard, we had a residence that paid upwards of $500,000 to go into the creative bonus pool. It's to be earmarked for neighborhood improvements, is what I thought I heard, you know, area improvements. But the county hasn't seen an amount of money like that before, I don't think. Typically, they would see, this is what I feel, it's $15,000 to $18,000 contributed towards this pool of money that then would be used for budgeted, or unbudgeted items, pedestrian improvements, trails, where it might be within the general area that person contributed. I don't know how that works. And if it's in addition to qualifying for 2750 through GQMS first, right? You have to get the 2750 person, you know, an election, you can make to contribute more. Or is that? Or is it an exemption again?
So again, if it's a lot that has the right already to build at
Okay.
5750, so then they compete to go beyond that. So up to, you know, 85, whatever it might be. Again, with the scoring criteria, right, we've definitely had people, you know, say, well, there's really nothing I can do on my lot. There's nothing I can do in my neighborhood, but, you know, what else does the fire department need?
Right.
You know, right, they put money towards things that they can, you know, tie back saying how, this is how it could benefit.
And how does that money roll back into the community then?
Well, again, they have to make very specific commitments to the fire department or to, I don't know, sometimes the Roaring Fork Conservancy, if they had some specific project. If it's a public improvement, you know, for the county to do a road improvement, it's going to go to Public Works. And we actually, like, the system now is, we've gotten much better dialed in about, right, if you've made this commitment, then you're going to record a covenant that says, I got this, you know, this is how I have to use it. And I have paid for all of these things I said I was going to pay for. They actually hand us the receipts that we attach to that covenant now when you record it. So then everybody knows that they've done these things.
Can the neighborhood have an opportunity to put feedback into that system and say, hey, here's our neighborhood, we call it X, Y, and Z between Cemetery Lane and Highlands. That community offer up suggestions through the county's administration to if that happens, that opportunity comes along, because we get on the list somehow.
I mean, the way we usually look at it, I mean, the applicants go out to people and say, is there anything we can do in your area,
Well,
you
that's
know,
not
that would
happening.
benefit you? I mean, that's really more how it works.
Okay.
You know, but for the county, right, to have, you know, it's more, do we already have capital improvements we've identified? And could somebody walk in and say, that's one I could help with because it makes sense. It's my area, and I could say, hey, I'm gonna throw X amount of money towards that.
That's a very objective community benefit. Some of the community benefits in my mind we should look at are things like conservation, protection of wildlife habitat. Those all have different definitions for everybody. I think circling back to what we're looking at on the climate change thing, same thing. The other question I had was, in the 80s, what happened? It was quiet years. I think looking down valley and seeing what happened within the boundary of Pickens County and Eagle County during that time as there was development that was pushed down. Our company was really happy with the 3% growth rate that we were seeing every year in our business. But then the growth rate down valley created a lot more demand on us to go service that population, which created more employees. And then it kind of flipped back up here. So there was a lot of displacement of development, I think, that happened just from being involved in it, not from studying it, but our market share in different places changed. And it changed from public, from private to open space improvements to 6 or 7 wetland ski area expansion. So it changed with how the market changed. I'd like to see maybe if we can reach out beyond our satellite here and look at that. The other thing I found interesting on the issue of 3% use tax in those days and now, private sector pays a 3% use tax on projects that bring in materials from outside Pickens County. Concretes, gravels, and things that we purchased, 50% of what we bought was going to tax exempt public projects. And that was those are pretty big projects, a hospital expansion, schools, nonprofits, things like that. So that's kind of another area I think that was interesting that was going on. And 3% I think goes road and bridge. How does that funnel back into the community as a benefit? And should it be more or less? Should it match up with what the infrastructure needs are? How does that fit with an airport expansion, for example, which is huge? They pay because everything is going to come from outside Pickens County, and that's an important thing to look at in terms of what are we looking at. Is a question that's huge.
Yeah, Rick, those are really good points in understanding the tools in the toolbox and some of the trends that we're going to be looking at our next meeting as well. So I think this gives us some good thematic stuff to focus on. And I do want to make sure, time check, we're at 5:30, that we hear from everybody. And then Michael, I hope we answered some of your questions you want to run over, but probably not all.
The sort of path to being exempt, it said that there's, that largely it's because it brings community benefit. What's the process to determine what's exempt and what isn't?
I mean, most of those are just set out in the code. These are the things that are exempt from growth management.
Yeah.
And therefore, I mean, there may be some other process. There may, you're gonna have to go through site plan review, or you're going to have to be designated to the historic register, or you're gonna go through a rezoning to be a conservation development PDD. But underlying all of that is the understanding that the development created through that is not going to have to compete with growth management.
Right. So I think it looks like you have some of them highlighted. Are these ones that are maybe viewed as being the unintended consequences crew, or?
I don't know if they're well, yes, and I mean, I think those are the ones that I think everybody's probably thinking most about when to understand what is growth management, and right, that it's really only not many people are subdividing, so not much is competing in growth management for a new lot. But there are a lot of pre-existing lots out there that are being developed.
Yeah. And then on the community goals list, which I looked at that and I felt like within the scoring system, that felt like it could really be updated with some different things. I'm curious when the last time it was updated.
The actual scoring criteria, 2006. I don't think we've messed with the criteria. There've been a lot of conversations about it maybe being inadequate in various realms, but I don't think we've changed those scoring criteria since the 2006.
And then how is that, who determines that? I mean, obviously, we might have the potential to influence that, but how was that list created?
That would have been the whole, I mean, again, the process at the time with creating the new code that went through, an extended public process. Again, at that point, it was adopting an entire new land use code, that just being one piece of it, but.
Ultimately, the BICC.
But initially in 1978, the criteria was looking at things like whether an application was competing in terms of addressing infrastructure and services. I think we wanted to make sure that the growth could be, that we were keeping up with services and infrastructure as it related to growth. So and utilities, those kinds of things were actually part of the scoring criteria initially in 78. And then we moved on from there and recognized that, well, those things are really wholly addressed in other ways now. And so the criteria evolved in theory to address issues that became more relevant to the community. And so it's really just been a conversation over the years trying to pinpoint those really critical community benefits. And it's affordable housing has, became one of the pieces that was in the forefront. And there were other criteria that became more relevant just as we understood growth. But we have had a lot of conversation over the years about whether the criteria is still relevant and still addresses the community needs. I'll leave it at that.
And like just within that question, so like with road systems and transit as being two of the criteria that you can get positive scores for, is everything viewed like through an additive lens, which is like you're going to build something that's not there? Is there any kind of a reduction lens that's used for this, which is you're going to, you will minimize workforce generation, you will minimize vehicle trips as a way to get a high score within one of those?
Lower density.
So the generating employees piece does not play out in the scoring system at all. I guess the simple answer to that one. In terms of minimizing other impacts, right? Not really. I mean, it's not, and it's complicated too, particularly when you're talking about, I have an existing house that's already there. I want to add more floor area to it. What are the impacts of that? And the code talks about proportionality in growth management, about how do you decide what's a proportional incremental impact based on another 2,000 square feet on a house or not. But right, it does not, you wouldn't see language talking about, am I reducing, somehow, other than, I guess, no, I should say, the criteria about reduce your floor, are you building less floor area than you could otherwise under zoning? You get scored a higher point if you say, I could build 15,000, but I will limit myself to 8,250 forever. Or I will limit my height to less than what I'd be allowed. So there's those reductions, but not some of the other things you're.
And Michael, I think what you're hitting on too is that scoring system is dated. It hasn't been revisited since 2006. So there are a lot of things, climate, some of the workforce impacts that we're all talking about that are going to need to be revisited as we move into the next phase of this discussion.
Right, and I think maybe the last thought perhaps is sort of leading to that, which is I feel like we're coming to this really granular understanding of the terms of the game, as you put it. But we're gonna like the concern. I think the reason that we're here is that there are like terms of the concerns and the terms of what people are feeling, and trying to figure out how to match those up. Like we've been given a dashboard of 50 dials, right? And I think it's like, okay, well, the dial that I wish I could turn down is vehicle trips, and where's that dial within the terms of the game?
And I think that's exactly where we're going to be going, is understanding how it works today, opens the door to what are the dials and the tools that we have as we revisit and revise the code as it exists. And I want to make sure that we have time for the rest of our discussion tonight. Alex, do you want to jump us to slide 40? The time slush fund that I had for tonight was the statement of purpose, the BOCC vision and goals. This is where we're headed in the work of the committee. So we're gonna table this portion of the discussion because we had so much good Q&A for our next meeting. But I do want to go into our governance conversation. So we've had a lot of terrific nominees from all of you for our governance. In our conversations with each person who has been nominated, we had one common theme, and that was time commitment and the lack thereof. So in talking with more than a dozen of you, many of you just simply were not able to play that role. And there was actually no one who said, I have the time commitment and the capacity to be a chair for this committee. So where we are evolving into is a potential co-chair structure that would provide 2 co-chairs who would govern the committee with the planning team side by side, and there would be a resiliency and a backup structure. So if one co-chair couldn't make a meeting, the other co-chair would have a proxy. We did not want to make this change unilaterally. We want to discuss it with all of you. And if you all are amenable to a co-chair structure instead of a chair and a vice chair, where the 2 co-chairs would equally govern, and we would work out with those chairs what the decision-making process is, we would move forward with our nominees who had agreed to be to serve that role and who had the interest and the time to serve that role. So you can see our nominees listed here. But before we even get to that, I want to do a little yes, no, go with the flow exercise on is that evolution of governance from chair, vice chair to co-chairs acceptable to this group. So I'm going to ask that Alex pulls up our virtual attendees, and if you could all turn your cameras on. And just do a quick poll with the group. Does that evolution sound good to everyone? Anybody
Yes.
have any concern with that?
Does it really solve the problem?
We-
Of like, are you just
Yeah,
getting 2
that's
people
very
who
good
said, I don't
question.
have time to be the chair to say, well, you're the chair.
Yeah.
Like, you're just gonna be the chair with somebody else. Like, does the time split become 50-50? Yeah, I'm not sure.
That's
I'm
the
like
that's a question we've
equally
been
concerned.
that's a question we've been asking ourselves is, what we want and talking with our nominees and Michael, I know you're one, of how that would work operationally, and that the onus would not fall on the chairperson to do a lot of heavy lifting. The role and as we described it as our last meeting is not going to be in the tactical implementation, but really helping to guide the strategy and during the meetings, help to keep the discussion moving and set the agenda and the strategy of the group. So Kara.
And if I could, maybe to, sorry, I'll stand up so you don't have to. crank your head. I think maybe to address some of the concerns on time commitment too, what we were talking about as a planning team is, I think what would be really valuable, understanding everyone's timing, is being able to join in one kind of strategy meeting in between the meetings to help say, what's the agenda that we want to go, a little bit of debrief of where the committee was headed, what's the strategy that we want to head in the next, not just the meeting up ahead, but 2 meetings ahead, and really looking for, a co-chair structure. And to your point, Michael, is it different of a chair or vice chair, but just to understand the time commitment piece, from the planning team perspective, at a bare minimum, I think that's what we're looking for, is to have those people be able to be even in just kind of one planning meeting in between these meetings to make sure we're responding to the needs and the direction that this committee wants to head. And then as it relates to the tactical, as Miles was saying, once we're in the meeting, it's kind of helping to facilitate the conversation along and the dialogue. And any other staff members jump in, but giving a little bit maybe more clarity of what we are seeking from the co-chairs as your planning team for this committee.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a great idea to evolve the leadership model and the governance model that we've been looking at for 50 years. In that this is designed to be collaborative, not an expert, led testimonial type process. It's more community-based, it's more citizen engagement, it's more empowering us to come in here and give you our opinions in a transparent way. and let us use our talents to support the system. And the system as it exists today is not necessarily geared towards that. We have public hearings that you get 3 minutes. The guy that's applying for the chief QMS process gets 45 minutes. We've had to deal with people that have like minds about something to pool their minutes and listen to 45 minutes of, testimony from one person who's representing 25. There's too many things to deal with there. So there's a great example of that model that maybe we could put up next time. People are looking at in these kinds of arenas that I find to be really, really interesting. And we did this unconsciously, intuitively in the Basalt for a few years. And we increased our community engagement 10 times. That has eroded a little bit, but I think we can bring it back. And this forum is good for that. So I support Kira's idea. And it's the Search Institute has come up with this. So it's not my idea.
And Rick, that is the point, is to create that shared governance and not put, too much onus on any one person as a chair, but have a shared governance to guide the meeting. So
I think the strategic planning piece of it too would allow people to come into that picture when they felt comfortable contributing versus a set group that's strategically planning for, so you can come have a little flexibility in how you approach these meetings. Look at the agenda, give your feedback in between, and offer other pieces of information.
And that is the intent, is to provide collaboration, flexibility, and resiliency, and hearing no concerns. Not that we really had much of a choice after talking with our nominees. The second question for the group is, given this evolution of the governance structure, would you like more time to nominate yourself or to nominate other members in addition to the 6 that we have? Or would you like to hear from each of them about why they're interested in the position, the value they think they would bring in their approach to co-governing the committee tonight, and then take our vote tonight? So that is the second question. Would you like more time, or would you like to proceed with the vote tonight, and then we would hear from our nominees?
Has anyone of that group said, yes, I have time, I can do.
Every single one. We've talked to every single one. There were about twice as many folks who were nominated, the majority of which who did not have the time. These have all agreed to serve in a co-chair, no chair, but a co-chair capacity.
Rick, I didn't fully understand, if you all did, then it doesn't matter, but I didn't fully understand if you were suggesting something other than this.
No, I support.
He was supporting the
co-chair
co-chair
idea.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Right.
And more participation.
So are you interpreting this as everyone could be?
No, I think I would nominate you, Michael, if you was one of them.
Maybe they already did.
As a communication director and your contacts out in the community, that brings a broad base of information to it.
Well, I appreciate it, but like, could it be more than 2? Like, is that worth?
The issue we get in there is that it would then become a quorum of the group that would require noticing, and so we would need to keep it at 2 to avoid that procedural issue, which is kind of which is a major hurdle to that.
So you're asking us if we want it tonight.
The question is
two of the 6.
Exactly. The question is, who would like to vote tonight? And if we could pull up our virtual attendees. I'm counting 1, 2, now 3, 4.
Go either way.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then of our virtual participants, can I see hands? I've got Lydia and Emma. Am I missing anyone? Lydia and Barb.
Barb, Adam, all have thumbs up.
11, 12. And I've got a couple thumbs sideways. It looks like Chris and Randy may be our tiebreakers here because we're going to be close. Who here by show of hands would prefer to wait and have an additional week and a half to nominate others by show of hands? 1, 2, 3.
I'm just curious, what I'd love to hear from the sideways people. My mind can be changed there.
Okay.
Or
Yeah.
hear from them
Let's
tonight
hear.
and vote on October 5th.
That is the decision for the group. So let's hear from our folks who would like more time. Starting with Joe.
You may know, Miles, I asked for this list a week ago of those who were willing to put in the time. And, you know, it just wasn't available. So I would just like to have a little more time to go back and look at the bios more carefully now that I have a list of bodies.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And Joe, I know, you know, we were talking with our nominees up until within just the last couple hours of the meeting, trying to see who indeed was willing. So it's very much a building the plane for flying it. And now we do have our list, and potentially a growing list if we decide not to vote tonight. So I'm curious who else voted to wait. Tim, yes.
I've been on the fence whether or not to submit or not, and I'd like a little more time.
That's fair. Mona.
I had the same reaction as Joe did, just to look a little bit more closely. I mean, I think I know most of the people that are already up there, but just to.
So I'm hearing a key theme, and let's have a little more time for those who were not prepared to vote tonight. For thumb sideways, Randy, what's your position?
That's just a matter of being flexible. I could go tonight, but I mean, to my comment to you, you know, I also would like to drill down a little bit more on the applications of these folks who are willing to participate as chair. So I don't really see a downside in that. On the other hand, everybody wants to talk tonight and the rest of the group wants to vote tonight. I can do that too.
Well, I will tell you, my preference as a facilitator to do things with unanimous consensus. So if we take a little more time, understand our committee members, I don't see a downside to it if the group concurs, but I want to open it up to anyone virtually joining us. Any comments that are different from what we've heard for the virtual participants? And did I see you on mute? My screen is a little small, my cheat screen. Maybe not. Okay, well, how about one more comment?
Just a quick comment. So my willingness to serve was conditional. It was, I think we mentioned on the phone, I was curious to see if there would be others that would stand forward, because obviously as a utility CEO, I got a lot of things going. I also think it's really important that whoever serves in the co-chair variety capacity is a resident of Pitkin County, which I'm not. So take me off the list, please, now that we've got other friends. And I'm so glad, thank you, thank you. Well, I'll serve if needed, but I think there are lots of other folks that are much more qualified than I, so make it 2 out of 5 then instead of 2 out of 6.
Well, and I will just reinforce what I've told many of you already. I think everyone on this committee is qualified to serve as a co-chair. It is a time commitment issue. And I think we're answering our own question, just looking at the time that we have left in this meeting, that I want before any vote that we give all of our nominees time to speak and just make some brief remarks. So given the time we have left in this meeting, my proposal to the group would be that now that we know our shrinking list of nominees.
Yeah, and if I find out who nominated, you're off my Christmas list.
It was anonymous, I will never tell. But my proposal would be that unless anyone is opposed, we take a little more time for additional nominees to come forward, to give our nominees a little more time to prepare, and then we plan to vote definitively on October 5th. Is there anyone opposed to that? Can we do a thumbs up? Thumbs up. And I'm looking at my virtual team.
And opposed to or not opposed?
Anyone opposed to waiting? Anyone opposed to waiting?
Opposed to waiting.
Oh, opposed.
Yeah, so we will wait and we will vote at the next time.
So Miles.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're waiting. If we're gonna wait and somebody else steps up, like Tim sounded like he was
Right. It gives
kind
us
of
more
thinking about
time.
it, obviously, please let us know
Yes,
if that happens. Otherwise, we're just gonna think about the 5 people that we have.
precisely. So this gives us more time to get to out of 5 or 5.
Yeah.
And
I also. public director for Brad.
You got the right number, 5 is the
Before we
correct.
get timed out here,
yes,
Brian was asking I think you were asking, correct me if I'm wrong, what are the problems that you're experiencing with GMQS?
Yeah.
Are you going to address that for us and bring that to us as a subject to discuss?
yeah, most definitely. That is really the statement of purpose for this committee, is looking at what are the problems today and how do we how do we reconcile it and begin to solve them? So that very much, it may take more than just one meeting, but that is very much where we're going. And I think we started to hit on it with some of the scoring criteria. We're already seeing challenges and problems with that. So just to very clearly stick with the group, we will vote on October 5th. Everybody's good with that.
Miles, do we want those that are interested to send an email to the group, a blurb about yourself, why you're interested, so we can share it with the larger team here, because it sounds like everybody would like that for those that are interested for that co-chair.
Yeah, absolutely. You can do that. The nomination form will remain active. That's the reason collecting all the nominees. So if anyone else is interested or would like to nominate someone else and risk being on the Christmas list, then we'll keep that open until our next meeting. And we will share any new nominees as they come. Does that sound fair?
Just real quick, where do we find people's bios? Is that?
People, we will share that out. We will share just our nominees. And then we will add.
To get to them.
I kind of looked around.
Well, and now that we know who our
Yeah.
5 are, and we
Perfect.
literally just had that
That's
finalized
great.
this afternoon, we will share all of their bios with the full group coming up. So very quickly, just to run through where we're going from here. Our next meeting, October 5th, when we will be voting tentatively at the Rocky Mountain Institute, unless there are any decisions have been made that I don't know about. Okay, so it's confirmed. Okay, so that will be our Mid-Valley meeting.
Oh, no, that's all.
So-
Used to be old stuff.
Basalt.
Moved to Basalt.
I don't think we're.
You're talking about the basalt office of RMI, not the
Correct.
original building.
Correct.
Yes, that's all.
The innovation center.
The Innovation Center, and we'll get all of that detail out to everyone, but we will be in the alternating cadence. That was the preference of this group, going down Valley for our next meeting, and then coming back for meeting 5, potentially even in this room. Our goal is to solidify 2 locations, whether it's the Basalt Library or RMI, and then whether it's here or another Up Valley location. So we have predictability and we don't have to be going to different locations every time. So that is our goal. We will continue to get packets out to you 1 week in advance. So everything we covered tonight, there's also a few things that we will be adding. The 1999 study that Ellen referenced is already up on the website. It looks like that link was just added in the last hours of the day here. The TDR report, the statement of purpose and the vision summary, since that is where we're headed to really talk about how are we going to operate and solve some of those big issues that we started to address tonight. And then re-looking at the land use code if you haven't already from the last packet. So there's some good work there.
And the meetings will continue to be hybrid. So for those of you who really can't make it down Valley for the next meeting, you know, there is the hybrid option. And that would be true for all of the meetings moving forward.
Miles, just a
Yeah,
quick
John.
question. Is there a timeline that we are targeting to try and make an impact, make change? I mean,
February,
Yes, absolutely. So, and this is going to be bigger here on this screen. You can see our meeting cadence. It's already evolving, but our goal is to have some of the finalized recommendations by early February. So it's a pretty compressed schedule. It's an aggressive schedule, but that is the one we're endeavoring to stick to.
Follow-up question related to that, which is, I don't see where affordable housing is on this list. And Debbie's question and John's questions about housing kind of triggered just some additional questions for me. So John's question of if you've got a 2,000 square foot house, you can build up to 5,750. Well, do you have affordable housing mitigation for that? Why or why not? What are the impacts when you're going 5,750 or 15,000 related to housing, and what are the requirements that people have? And I think that would be helpful, at least for me, to understand the housing along with the kind of sustainability and the climate impacts, because it seems like that's maybe where this group ultimately goes.
And Jessica, I think that's a great transition into our coming meeting when we start to look at the vision, the goals, and the values, and talking about what's missing from our values. And maybe that's an important one that we need to incorporate, or a goal we need to recommend that's included for the BOCC. So that's exactly where we're going is what is missing and what needs to be added, whether it's a scoring criteria or it's an overarching major goal that we need to factor in. So it may not be captured here. This is kind of the big roadmap, but I think that's a critical question that we as a group will need to answer.
And Miles, I just want to answer a question that was brought up about the subgrade space and employee impact fee. If it is habitable subgrade space like a basement, it is counted for the employee impact fee. If it's uninhabitable, like a crawl space, that is not counted into that fee. So just got confirmation from the building reviewer who does that. So since I was fresh, want to make sure you guys got that information.
Yes, Suzanne.
With your mentioning the hybrid option, I
Yes.
had to attend on Zoom the last time, and I could hear almost nothing.
Okay.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
and in this room, with
But
the,
that was
we don't have
Basalt.
microphones.
That was Basalt and Suzanne. We actually have these two owls, which are going to, I think, be upgraded into a better system.
Good.
But tonight, the audio from our virtual participants, what I'm hearing in the chat has been much better. The audio and the video at the Salt Library was one of the major challenges to going back there. That's why we're going to be at RMI while we troubleshoot to see if we can make the Salt a more viable option for the hybrid.
And one more thing, Rick Stevens, if you would talk to Ellen about the latest house size cap in that Brush Creek caucus decided upon, it could go on this list.
Shall I respond? We have had some lengthy conversation about that. And it is a recommendation in the Brush Creek Master Plan to look at that house size cap. It hasn't been adopted. The plan has been adopted, but it has to be adopted in the land use code as a new standard under zoning. So the recommendation has been made in that master plan, but not yet implemented through a land use code amendment.
How long will that take? I mean, I think it's important information. It's more up-to-date information, at least as a trend.
Yes.
That caucuses are.
I think that's a great transition to our next meeting too, where we're going to be looking at some of those trends, because hopefully in some, as we're 2 minutes over, I would say in some and in closing, the meeting before this, we looked at where we've been with the origination of the growth management system tonight. Hopefully we established how it's working today. Certainly, we're going to have other questions that come up that we're going to need to refine. And then we'll set the stage for where is this committee headed? What are the trends that we're seeing? What's the vision, goals, and values that we're going to be operating within? And that's what we're going to be getting into on October 5th. So hopefully we've achieved the first two parts of where we've been and where we are today, so that we can start looking to the future. Any final comments? Well, thank you all for being here tonight, and we appreciate your time. We will vote at the next meeting.
Yeah.